Today we're going to briefly go over 3 common law defenses that employers use when fighting on-the-job injury claims. So an employee has been injured on the job and wants to find the employer liable for the injury. The employer, when justified, can present one of the following 3, or perhaps a combination, depending on the situation, of the 3 common law defenses that you'll see behind me on the board, and we're just going to go over those briefly. Things that an employer can say that might mitigate their liability for the on-the-job injury. So we'll begin then with assumption of risk. Assumption of risk defense basically says when the employee took this job, they understood that the job's nature necessarily entailed a certain level of risk. They knew that when they took the job, and because they actually received the results of that risk, the employer should not be held responsible. You got sick or injured because you took a job that exposed you to sickness or injury. Perhaps an example might be someone who works in a hospital and comes down with a disease. It might be argued, you took a job in a hospital. Working in a hospital around sick people necessarily entails the risk of you catching their communicable disease, even when you take precautions. So you took the assumption of the risk, knowing that working around people with communicable diseases might communicate that disease to you. Knowing that risk going in, you cannot hold me liable for the fact that you came down with the disease. And there are other high-risk types of jobs out there, working on oil rigs and things like this, around heavy equipment. There's an assumption, a basic assumption of risk, and so it might be argued by the employer that the employee knew of the risks and therefore cannot hold the employer liable for receiving the results of that risk. The second type of common law defense on injury claims is contributory negligence. Contributory negligence. In this scenario, basically what the employer is going to argue is that yes, they were hurt on the job, but it's because they contributed their own negligence. The employee was negligent, not the employer. So the employee wants to argue that the employer was negligent and that's why I got hurt. The employer can counter-argue, no, we have a set system by which if they had followed that system, it would have reduced the risk. They went outside our parameters, outside of our procedures and protocols. They did their own thing. They got hurt. They're negligent. They contributed their negligence and therefore that's why they were hurt. There are a lot of different examples here that might be found, but basically if an employer has taken reasonable precautions and put together reasonable procedures to help protect the employees and an employee ignores those procedures and protocols and gets hurt, then they can argue contributory negligence. Third, they can argue fellow servant rule. Here what they're saying, the employer will say, well, I understand that my employee followed the rules and follow the procedures and the protocols that I put in place. But it was not my fault, it was another employee's fault, a fellow servant. It was through the negligence of the assistant to the employee or through the negligence of another person who didn't properly maintain the equipment and follow the procedures and protocols. So in this case, you might say at a hospital once again, that one employee failed to properly dispose of an old needle, a used needle. They didn't put it in the proper plastic hard case that protects. They threw it away in a trash can, you picked up the bag, it came through the bag and punctured you. Well, instead of suing the employer and saying you're negligent, the employer can argue no, it was a fellow servant's negligence that led to your injury. So these are 3 basic common law defenses against injury claims that employers can use in the case of employees wanting to find the employer liable. That there might be the basic idea of when you took the job, you assumed the risk, you received, unfortunately, the downside of that risk assessment, but you can't hold me responsible when you knew you took the job and it had a certain level of risk too. Your failure to follow procedures and safety protocols led to your injury, therefore contributory negligence would minimize or negate the employer being held responsible. And finally, 3, it's not me, the employer, that's the problem. It's one of your fellow employees who didn't follow the rules, procedures, and protocols. Your fellow servant contributed to your problem there. This has just been a basic overview of 3 basic common law defenses against injury claims. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you click on that link, it'll take you to that website where you can get that information, and while you're there on that website, you should find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.